Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning everyone. My name is Nusaibah Binti and you can call me Sasa. I'm a medical student of Muhammadiyah University of Yogyakarta. And today I would like to present about my research. The title is about effect of childhood trauma on trauma personality in a sample of university students. Before I begin my presentation, I would like to highlight about my slide. The first one, I will talk about introduction, and then research question, and then literature review, and the next one is research method, and then I'll talk about discussion, and the last point is about conclusion. So, about childhood trauma. Childhood trauma has been a major public health problem that has been a problem for a very long time. Traumatic experience in childhood has an impact on personality, whether it's in adult or child. University students who had experienced childhood trauma might not be aware about the impact of childhood trauma on their trauma personality. So next, we'll talk about research question. The research question we divided into two questions. The first question is, what are the prevalence types of childhood trauma among university students? And the next one is there any significant relationship between childhood trauma and types of trauma personality among university students? Before we jump into the result, I would like to talk about childhood trauma. Childhood trauma, defined by the National Institute of Mental Health USA as the experience of an event by a child that is emotionally painful or distressful, which often result in lasting mental and physical effect. The Adverse Childhood Experience ACE study dividing childhood trauma into 10 categories. The first is about abuse of child, including sexual, emotional, and physical abuse, and then trauma in child environments, including parental substance abuse, parental divorce, mentally ill or suicidal household member, violence to mother, and impersonate household member. And the last is about neglect, whether it's child physical needs, physical or emotional. So the next after that, I'll also talk about trauma personality. So what is trauma personality? Trauma personality personality is a characteristic of person that account for consisting pattern of feeling, thinking, and behaving that shape from traumatic experience. And Pete Walker divided trauma personality into 4 categories. The first one is fight trauma personality. People with fight trauma personality tend to pursue power and control. The second one is flight trauma personality. People with flight trauma personality tend to escape into thought and action. And the third is about freeze trauma personality. People with freeze trauma personality tend to avoid human contacts. And the last one is about fawn types trauma personality. Fawn types trauma personality tend to being a people pleaser. The next is about the research methods. The study was conducted on secondary university students through an online survey, and the participants of this study are 35 university students in Indonesia. The study sample was made of male or female on second year university, and most of them have experienced traumatic experience in childhood, including verbal abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, or dysfunctional household, and only a few of them who never have experienced childhood trauma. The survey consisted of online questionnaire, and it's divided by 2 segments. The first one is about what types of childhood trauma that they have been experienced, and the next is about traumatic personality. And then we talk about the result of or the data. The first one is about the knowledge about childhood trauma. From the data, we likely know that most of the respondents, 29 respondents who have heard and understand about childhood trauma, where 6 respondents are never have heard about childhood trauma. And move on to the next data. So it's the data about childhood trauma prevalence by its type. So from the data, we are more likely to know about the highest prevalence of childhood trauma. It is the types of verbal abuse following physical abuse, and then neglect, and then dysfunctional household, and the last one is sexual abuse. From the data, we know that 16 respondents has experienced physical abuse, and most of them, 23 respondents, has experienced verbal abuse in their childhood, and then 9 respondents has experienced neglect, and 5 respondents had experienced dysfunctional household, and only a small number, only 4 of them, had experienced sexual abuse in their childhood. So for the next data is about the correlation between childhood trauma and 5 trauma personality. The correlation between childhood trauma and 5 trauma personality having different scores. For the respondent who had experienced verbal abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect in their childhood are most likely had significant higher score and tendencies to have 5 trauma personality than respondents who had never experienced verbal abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect. But however, there is negative correlation between someone who has experienced physical abuse and dysfunctional household. The respondent who had experienced physical abuse and dysfunctional household has more likely significant lower scores than someone who had never experienced physical abuse and dysfunctional household. Okay, so the next one, we talk about the correlation between childhood trauma and flight trauma personality. So from the data, there is 3 correlation that we can see. For someone who had experienced physical abuse, verbal abuse, and neglect in their childhood are more likely to have higher score and tendencies to have flight trauma personality than someone who had never experienced physical abuse, verbal abuse, or neglect in their childhood. But however, there is a negative correlation of someone who had never experienced dysfunctional household has more likely higher score and tendencies to have flight trauma personality than someone who had experienced dysfunctional household in their childhood. And then the last one, we have a similar scores for someone who had experienced sexual abuse in their childhood and someone who never had sexual abuse in their childhood. So the next one, we'll talk about the correlation between childhood trauma and freeze trauma personality. Okay, for the data, we can see that there is significant positive correlation in all of types of childhood trauma. So we can see that the respondent who had experienced physical abuse, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, and dysfunctional household are significantly having higher score and more tendencies to have freeze trauma personality than the respondent who had never experienced physical abuse, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, and also dysfunctional household. And the next one, we'll talk about correlation between childhood trauma and found trauma personality. So we can also see in here that there is also a significant positive correlation in all of types of childhood trauma, including physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, neglect, and dysfunctional household. And as we can see, the respondent who had experienced physical abuse, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, or neglect, or dysfunctional household are more likely to have higher score and having tendencies to have found trauma personality than someone who had never experienced physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, neglect, and dysfunctional household in their childhood. Okay, so from the data that we are already taught, in general, childhood trauma has significant correlation with trauma personality. The data affirms that many students have heard about childhood trauma, and most of them also have experienced different types of trauma in their childhood. So 29 of the respondents of second-year university students have heard, and most of them are more likely to have experienced traumatic experience in childhood. And the study findings that there is a significant correlation between physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, neglect, and dysfunctional household with freeze and found trauma personality. There is a positive correlation in it. But there's also negative correlation in fight and flight trauma personality. The problem can be occurred because there is many factors that can contribute with trauma personality rather than childhood traumatic itself. So the study from Xianbin Li in 2013 has also reported the same result, that there is a positive correlation with neuroticism personality and psychoticism personality with students who had experienced physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse in their childhood. So the study proved that a positive correlation between childhood trauma and found and freeze trauma personality exists. The last one is about the conclusion. The study showed that specific types of trauma and trauma personality trait are significantly correlated. The study that was conducted on 35 second university students of many departments have findings that there is a significant positive correlation. That also that many of second year university students have experienced many types of childhood trauma and also having tendencies to have trauma personality as well. So it is recommended for university in Indonesia to replicate these findings into a larger study so it can reduce a significant number of childhood trauma in Indonesia. And also the university can give proper facilities for those who have experienced or suffered from childhood trauma so it can reduce the effect of trauma personality in adults. I think that's all that I can give. I'm sorry that there is many mistake in this presentation. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.